The federal government says it wants to bring attention to thousands of murdered or missing Native women and children. But a long history of broken promises have many Native Americans questioning whether they can be trusted.
One thing I remember as a child was that we were taught to hide. And she was so afraid that someone, the government or whoever the powers to be, were going to come and grab us.
Ron Yob grew up in this small home in downtown Grand Rapids in the 60s. Before he even learned how to walk, his mother, Angeline Kelsey, taught him and his siblings to be prepared if a person in uniform showed up at their door.
So it just struck fear in us when people would knock on the door. There was a lot of paranoia. I don't think that paranoia ever left me.
Kelsey was one of thousands of children forcibly taken from their homes and sent to more than 300 boarding schools across the country.
She was taken away, and that traumatic experience existed still in their mind like 30 years later. You got to remember, at that time they were still trying to quote-unquote civilize the Indians.
Yob says his mother and her brother were taken from their family in the 1930s. She was 5 years old. They were taken to Holy Childhood in Harbor Springs, nearly 200 miles north of Grand Rapids.
Taken hundreds of, 100 miles away and was told to forget about her family, We're going to take the Indian out of you now, and we're going to take that language away from you. We're going to take any of your cultural things away from you.
Native American groups have record of thousands of tribal children who were taken away from their families.
There were places where Native American children were, forcibly or coercively institutionalized, but there were other locations where some Native American children were able to stay home.
The idea of, quote, Americanizing Indians began in the 1800s. By the 1920s, up to 85% of all Native American children were forced to assimilate.
Quite infamously, the phrase "kill the Indian, save the man" was said by General Richard Henry Pratt, the founder of the Carlisle Indian School, the first Native American boarding school of its kind, and really the flagship model.
At Indian boarding schools, students were prevented from speaking anything other than English.
Native children who spoke their tribal languages rather than English would receive poison placed on their tongues to burn their tongues. There was rampant sexual and physical abuse for identifying in any sort of way with their cultural practices, including language or spirituality, but also with just breaking the rules.
Students went missing. It is unknown how many.
If you go to many of these schools, you'll see children's cemeteries, which is actually a huge issue today as tribes are making the effort to repatriate some of those remains. And as they're going through that process, they're finding that a lot of the graves, are unmarked.
Government funding for the schools began to dwindle after World War I, causing most of them to close by the 1920s. But some, like Holy Childhood, stayed open until the early 80s.
I went to Holy Childhood in Harbor Springs, Michigan. I was 6 years old.
Many, like Philip Cantu, say they had a great experience during their time in boarding school and chose not to return home.
I learned a lot. You learn about brushing your teeth and keeping clean, sitting up straight, doing your homework, things that, after I got out of 8th grade that I knew when I went to high school. It was nothing new to me.
His school was part of a military-structured system, meaning the curriculum focused more on teaching trades and less on academics.
For women, it was being a domestic worker most often. For men, it was some type of manual labor.
It caused a generation to lose any kind of cultural traits they had, because your cultural traits are developed by the environment you're raised in.
As a teacher for more than 30 years, Yob says he's seen the long-lasting impacts boarding schools have had on his community.
They didn't trust the police. They didn't trust the principals. They didn't trust the counselors. They didn't trust the social workers. They had no respect for them. And what it started boiling down to, these kids didn't even respect themselves.
Trust and respect. Two concepts he and Cantu hope the new Missing and Murdered Indigenous Persons Initiative and Task Force will eventually earn.
Well, it's got to do positive things for people, because it's bringing an awareness that was denied before.